The 1980s is considered a nostalgic time for many. It's one of the most popular party themes where people get together and dress in over-the-top 80s style clothes with big hair and karaoke to love ballads and rock music of the decade. Kids of the 80s reminisce about their carefree childhoods and riding bikes with friends until the sun went down. But in real time, the city of Salt Lake City, Utah, and its surrounding areas were experiencing a dark evil lurking in their midst. Fresh off the 1970s reign of terror by serial killer Ted Bundy, the Utah city was trying to get back to a place of peace and serenity, with their quaint neighborhoods and snowy mountain backdrop. But year after year, some of their most vulnerable citizens were being targeted. Elderly women were being brutalized in their own homes. Police scrambled to link the cases as they added up, but what they found out was worse than they could have ever imagined. There was a serial killer and one-off killers. It was unfathomable that these esteemed citizens who had done so much for their community over the long lives they had led could be the target of multiple people wanting to harm them. A total of 10 elderly women were murdered in Salt Lake County in the 1980s, and another in 1990, and most of them have thankfully been resolved. Unfortunately, the case I have today has not been. It's nearly impossible that the woman I'm going to tell you about today would still be alive in 2024. If she were, she would be the oldest person alive in the world. But that doesn't change the fact that this community pillar had her life violently ended without the chance to age and die with dignity as she so deserved, and the person responsible may very well still be out there eluding accountability. This is A Simpler Time, True Crime, the murder of Bertha Hughes. It was March 18th, 1982. Bertha Hughes was a strong 81-year-old woman who, while having some health complications and difficulty with certain day-to-day tasks, was living as independently as possible. Bertha lived in a modest home at the intersection of 3405 South and 500 East Streets. In 1982, the location of her home was across from Granite High School. And Bertha at this time in her life had a favorite activity: sitting all cozy in her rocking chair and looking out her front window and people watching. I can hardly blame her. I love to people watch myself. I didn't think of all the elderly people I know who have done this. Not caught up in social media and the fast-paced frenzy of the modern world, just quiet and peaceful and taking in the activity around them. I think of my own grandmother, who's still alive at almost 97, and even though she has stayed active in her older years, she has always loved to watch people out her front window in her rocking chair. She'd get to know the neighborhood families, and people got used to seeing her too. And that's exactly how it was with Bertha. It was an absolute staple experience for the residents in her Salt Lake City neighborhood to see her and wave. And on March 17th at around 6:30 p.m., that's what people had seen. So back to March 18th, like I mentioned, the very next morning, Bertha had a home healthcare worker. This person checked in on her and helped her with some medications and daily support needs. Bertha had a heart condition and diabetes, and the nurse helped to monitor these as well. She also had limited mobility, and as this healthcare worker drove up, she felt like something just wasn't quite right. Bertha's curtains were drawn closed still, and normally that was just at bedtime. It was nearly 11 a.m., and Bertha was an early bird. So she cautiously approached the house, and with each step, she was more alarmed. The door was ajar and it looked damaged, and just steps inside the door on the living room floor was Bertha. The 81-year-old was clearly dead. She was face down on the floor and partially nude. The nurse called for help, and investigators and crime scene technicians arrived at the scene. They collected what evidence they could in 1982, which was limited. Bertha was transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Her death was very suspicious, but difficult to determine exactly what she had died from. Her home didn't have anything missing from it. It was quickly determined that Bertha was the victim of a violent sexual assault and homicide. She had been sexually assaulted, left partially undressed, and then beaten repeatedly. Authorities believe the killer left the badly beaten Bertha to die from her injuries in the living room. I mentioned before that Bertha was a beloved, known character of the community, but she also had a host of friendships in her greater Salt Lake City community as well as the city of Mount Pleasant, about 100 miles south of Salt Lake City. Bertha was born February 25, 1901 in Mount Pleasant. She was a devoted member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She married her husband, Joseph Bertha Hughes, in October of 1934. He had previously been married and had children from this previous relationship, and with Bertha, the couple welcomed 4 of their own children, 3 sons and a daughter. Unfortunately, Joseph would die young in January of 1941. Bertha didn't get remarried. She stayed devoted to her church and raising her children and stepchildren, a family which would grow into grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. And to clarify the math for you on that, it's because some of her stepchildren were older. Joseph was a good 10 years older than Bertha himself, and so her stepchildren, her 3 stepdaughters, were older than the children Bertha had biologically, and they were off having babies sooner. And so in total, she had 31 grandchildren, 42 great-grandchildren, and 3 great-great-grandchildren. Bertha was, in a word, involved in everything. Volunteer work, always staying busy throughout her life. She was a primary teacher and Sunday school teacher. She was also heavily involved in the church's women's organization. The LDS Church has this. It's called the Relief Society, and it's a women's organization for education and philanthropic work. It's huge. It has over 7 million women who take part in it worldwide, and Bertha served in the highly exclusive presidency sector of this group, so she was really high up. She was also a member of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. This is a group of LDS women who have direct lineage to original Mormon pioneers in this area, and they work together to preserve manuscripts and artifacts and landmarks and other church history and doctrine in this area. Bertha also served 2 terms as the Mount Pleasant City Treasurer. In the early 1960s, Bertha relocated from Mount Pleasant up north to Salt Lake City. She immediately got in all things involved with the church there, and she instantly made a ton of friends. So often you hear of elderly people who lose social connections and friendships, either because of isolation or just friends passing away over time. But Bertha kept a steady stream of friendships going. Her funeral drew in many of those grieving friends and family members. And her death also instilled fear into those elderly friends. What if she was targeted because she was a vulnerable older woman, they thought. One of Bertha's sons spoke on this to the Daily Herald. He said, quote, "They are terrified. They had so many flowers for her funeral that we wanted to give some of them to her friends, but we haven't been able to get some of them to answer the door. Some of them have pulled down their blinds, won't answer the door, and have turned their television sets for fear that someone may think they are home." End quote. That's a dark thing to think about. How often have you heard about burglary prevention and putting on TVs or lights or other things that would signify you are home and thus not a great target for a burglar just looking to break in and take your things without confrontation? But when you are the target, that advice all changes. Some thought these women were being overly cautious, but before long, those who were skeptical of all their precautions would soon learn how wrong they were. Police canvassed the neighborhood. Those in surrounding properties mentioned seeing Bertha sitting in her chair looking out the window at around 6:30 p.m. Another neighbor saw her as late as 8 p.m., which is the last reported sighting of Bertha alive. According to the Utah Department of Public Safety cold case webpage, other neighbors saw, quote, suspicious behavior surrounding her property that evening. But no sources elaborate on what exactly that means. Did they see a prowler or someone looking in her window? It's unclear. Here's what neighbors reported that has been made public. In the early morning hours of March 18th or the late evening hours of March 17th, they heard commotion. It was described as yelling and commotion coming from her home. By the time the visiting nurse got there on the 18th at 11 a.m., Bertha was dead. This left the window of time to be somewhere between 8 p.m. on the 17th and 11 a.m. on the 18th. Outside of canvassing, investigators got another lead. The police department began receiving numerous phone calls from neighbors who talked about a bizarre man ringing their doorbell as a magazine salesman, something they thought he might just be posing as and not an actual legit one. This person was described as a Caucasian man, about 30 years old, with a stocky build, dark hair, and a mustache, and was wearing a brown coat. Neighbors got a funny feeling about him, and one neighbor chalked that up to the fact that she felt uncomfortable with his conversation topics. She just felt like he was asking many unusual questions about the neighborhood, something he wouldn't actually need for his job. None of the source material says what he was exactly asking, but if I'm speculating, I would assume he was asking things like who lives in each house and some of the demographics and who is home and when. Investigators who processed the crime scene noticed that Bertha's door had been kicked in. Based on where blood and other evidence had been found, police were able to pretty solidly reconstruct what happened that night. It appears as though someone knocked at Bertha's door late into the evening. Bertha wouldn't have been expecting anyone then and was said to have always checked who was at the door through the peephole. It seems as though when she was peeking through the peephole, the intruder kicked in the door on her and the attack began right there in the entryway, then spilling over into the living room. Despite Bertha's frailty, she put up a heck of a fight, but had no ability to overcome the violence of her attacker. By the end of March, one of Bertha's sons joined forces with his employer, and together they put up a $5,000 reward, $2,500 at the time of an arrest and another $2,500 at the time of conviction. But this didn't really seem to generate anything new. Bertha's case slowed down in the momentum and began to sit. Investigators followed up on any lead that came in, but nothing new was really happening. No sign of the magazine salesman, no other suspicious behavior in the neighborhood, no new stories of family members or life insurance policies or acquaintances who had any feud with Bertha or anybody who benefited from her being dead. By August of 1982, a second body would renew fear in the community that a predator had struck again. In August of 1982, 72-year-old Wilhelmina Reed was found dead in her apartment. Wilhelmina, who went by Billy, lived at 959 West California Avenue. This is 5 miles northwest of Bertha's home. On August 18th, exactly 5 months after Bertha's murder, Billy Reed was found dead on her bed at around 1 p.m. Neighbors had grown concerned when they hadn't seen her at her normal times, and she didn't answer her door or her telephone. She, just like Bertha, had been beaten. Investigators did immediately think of Bertha Hughes, but they were hesitant to draw a connection too quickly. Billy Reed had not been sexually assaulted, and unlike in the case of Bertha, it did appear in Billy Reed's case that she had been robbed of some of her belongings, leading investigators to believe that robbery was a motive. Billy Reed was also a member of the LDS Church. She was born on Valentine's Day in 1910, and she held a career as an electronic assembler. She was known as being extremely crafty, and she had won an award for her crocheting at church. Again, she didn't have any known enemies or people who would financially benefit from her death. Like Bertha's case, Billy Reed's case quickly went cold. And as time went by, the community began to exhale a bit. 1983 went by without any incident, as well as 1984. Maybe as sad as these cases were and as important as they were to be solved, they were isolated incidents of opportunity. Or perhaps if it was one killer, the killer had moved out of the area and moved on. But in 1985, the community would be shook up again. Initially, though, the next case I'm going to be telling you about was not thought to be suspicious. but it soon would be pulled into and tied to a web of crimes committed by a sadistic predator. The next few parts of this story are going to be a bit of a ride, so if you're listening to this and multitasking like I do when I listen to podcasts, now will be the time you really want to buckle in. When I was reading all of the articles from both this time and years later and trying to piece all of this information together, I had multiple sheets of handwritten paper with color-coded highlighting and maps. But I promise I have done the work so that I can make it as simple as possible for you. So hang in there with me. On July 11th, 1985, the daughter of 69-year-old Thelma Blodgett arrived at her mother's home to find her unresponsive in the bathtub. She quickly drained the water and called 911. She began to try to do life-saving measures on her mother, and when first responders arrived, they took over. But it would be in vain. Thelma, who went by Tilly, was dead. Thelma had heart issues, and her death was ruled as that of heart failure. In fact, if you read her obituary, which I will have posted on our Instagram, at Simpler Time Crime Pod, you'll see it written right there. Police Sergeant Jim Forrester had requested a medical examiner to respond to the scene, but they curtly told him that they were tied up and sent what he described as a man in a pickup truck to pick up the body. As such, very little evidence was collected from the scene because it was just thought to be an unattended death by natural causes. Sergeant Forrester actually wrote a letter in complaint of this incident. He just felt that their behavior and responsiveness was in poor taste and not responsive. But Thelma's daughter didn't feel right about it. Sure, her mother had some heart issues and was known to have hardened arteries from previous medical testing. But her daughter said several items of value were missing from her mother's home, and she wondered if she had been murdered. Detectives told her they had no evidence to support a homicide had taken place, and that there was no signs of violence or indications of a homicide on her body. So with that, a few days later, Thelma was buried and her children were left to grieve with suspicious feelings in the pit of their stomach. Exactly a week later, on July 18th, 1985, a sweet 83-year-old retired schoolteacher named Drusilla Ovard was found in her bathtub. Drusilla lived at 1457 Logan Avenue, 4 miles northeast of Bertha Hughes' house. Initially, those who first responded to the scene were not sure how she died, but when she was transported to the medical examiner's office, disturbing things were found. Drusilla had been beaten and strangled. With that knowledge, investigators went back to the scene and processed it through a brand new lens. A little bit more about Drusilla. She was born in January of 1902 in Idaho. She grew up as a middle child in a family of 11 children. Her family moved all over when she was a child, and she lived part of her childhood in Alberta, Canada, before settling back home in Paris, Idaho in 1915. Drusilla was also a member of the LDS Church, and she married her husband in the temple in 1925. She obtained her teaching degree from Ricks College in 1931 and taught school all over Idaho. She and her family moved to Salt Lake City in 1942, where she continued teaching and raising her children. She also worked at the Rehabilitation Center at Fort Douglas. She continued her education and finished out another degree at the University of Utah. She continued on her teaching in the Granite School District, the same school district that was located across the street from Bertha's home, until her retirement in 1967. Drusilla enjoyed her retirement with her children and grandchildren. She had a very special bond with her one granddaughter, Kathy. Kathy was quoted as saying that her grandmother's death destroyed her and that she was the love of her life. They spent time together frequently and had even spent time together on the afternoon before her murder. Kathy clung to those memories. Detective Ken Farnsworth was tasked with leading the investigation into Drusilla's murder. Disturbingly, Drusilla was found with a semen-soaked towel near her body. It didn't appear that Drusilla was sexually assaulted, at least from any of the source material I could find, but the towel did lead them to believe that there was a sexual component to the crime. In 1985, there wasn't DNA testing that they could do anything with this, so they saved it, but they couldn't test it against anything. Detective Farnsworth was not a trained criminal profiler, but he had worked enough cases to come up with a hunch. Based on some injuries and marks on Drusilla's body, he suspected that she put up a major fight and that she may have injured her attacker. So, going off this hunch and without anything else to go on, he told patrolling deputies to be on the lookout for a daytime burglar with injuries to his right hand. The reason he suspected his right hand was the heavy blows Drusilla had sustained to her left side. 2 weeks later, this hunch paid off. Police interrupted a burglary in which a daytime burglar was breaking into an elderly woman's home. 70-year-old Carol Nelson was not home at the time, but witnesses noticed the break-in and phoned police. This house was 2 blocks away from Drusilla Overett's home. The man they arrested was a 25-year-old named Daniel Ray Troyer. His right hand was wrapped and his left hand had a towel in it, a towel just like the one found at Drusilla's home. He also had a knife and scissors. After the arrest, it was noted that Troyer's hand was not just bandaged up, it was actually broken and there was bruising all over it. In interviewing Troyer, Farnsworth realized pretty quickly that he had his man. For starters, Troyer was on parole for raping and beating an elderly woman in 1978. She was elderly and a paraplegic. It still blows my mind, but I'm no longer surprised that people are paroled so quickly for such violent crimes. And, like many of my cases, this isn't the last time you're going to be angry with me. Troyer made up a story that he slammed his hand in his friend's garage, breaking it. But when they asked that friend about this, they realized the friend didn't even have a garage. They interviewed Troyer's live-in girlfriend who told a different story. She said Troyer had injured his hand while working at the Holiday Inn doing maintenance. Unbeknownst to her, Troyer had been lying to her about even having a job. Despite Detective Farnsworth's suspicions, he didn't have enough evidence to bring him to trial for murder. So in the meantime, they charged him with a burglary that they had interrupted. As he sat in prison, Troyer's girlfriend began to spiral and question everything about her relationship with Troyer. Her conscience was weighing on her, and she made a phone call to investigators. She told them that just a week before Drusilla's murder, their elderly neighbor had died. And who was this elderly neighbor, you ask? Yes, it was Thelma Blodgett, the woman who police thought had died of heart issues. She went on to talk about Troyer's odd behavior on this day. She worked at a factory about a mile from their home. It was a sweltering hot July day, and his girlfriend said that Troyer had jogged the mile up the road to visit her at work. She was surprised by it because she thought he was supposed to be at work. He was out of breath from running. She told Troyer he needed to leave because she wasn't allowed any visitors, but he said he would wait outside until she could drive him home. He didn't give her any tangible reason for why he had come and why he wouldn't just turn around and walk back home when she wasn't getting off for hours. After she clocked out that evening, they pulled into their driveway to see police and ambulances at their neighbor's house. Alarmed, his girlfriend said, "What do you think happened?" And he said, "Oh, some old lady probably died of a heart attack or something." But Farnsworth cross-checked the times that the call came in about Thelma's death, and it would have come after he had already left for the factory. So there was no possible way he could have known what happened unless he was there. Troyer served time in prison for burglary until 1988. It was then he was released to the Bonneville Correctional Facility, a halfway house. He was still serving out his 1 to 15-year sentence, but he was allowed to do this transitional program at the halfway house. Detective Farnsworth felt that Troyer was their man and that he would continue to kill again if he was not caught. So he hoped to keep tabs on him and catch him in the act, but before he could kill. And unfortunately, it would not work out this way. Sergeant Farnsworth retired from the police department and asked his successor, Sergeant Jim Bell, to pick up where he left off. But Troyer's newfound freedom extended. A goal of the halfway house is to help people get on their feet and put things into place so that they can be successful when they are fully discharged from their status as being incarcerated and they're just released altogether. And listen, overall, I am a huge supporter of this. I believe a lot of systemic prison issues and how people reoffend has to do with the lack of basic needs being met when they are released from prison. Food and housing being some of them. So when Daniel Troyer said he wanted to go to a barber school to help learn a new trade and to gain future employment, he was allowed to do this. But there was a problem. This was going to provide Daniel Troyer much more freedom without any mechanism to safeguard his actions. And unfortunately, 2 more women would pay the price. On August 17th, 1988, an 88-year-old woman named Ethel Luckow was found dead. She lived at 357 East 17th South. There was no obvious signs of a struggle or cause of death. Sergeant Jim Bell didn't want to jump to conclusions too quickly, but he had become kind of paranoid about these deaths of elderly women. In one sense, it's very common all over the world for there to be unattended deaths of elderly women for natural causes. On the other hand, Salt Lake City was having a real issue with elderly women dying in what first appeared to be natural deaths, only to be found out as homicides. Ethel was born on August 15, 1900. On August 15, 1988, she had attended an 88th birthday party thrown for her. That was on a Monday. Friends and family tried to get in touch with her throughout the week without success. At 6 p.m. on Thursday, those relatives that had been trying to get in touch with her came to check on her and found her dead. Like what police had done in other cases, the family initially thought she died of a health concern related to her advanced age, so they called a mortician to come and pick up the body. But when they arrived, or when the mortician, I should say, arrived, they began asking some questions, such as, was it common for Ethel to sleep without clothes on? For some people, it absolutely is. That's just a thing people do. But her family said this was not a practice they knew of for her. As he examined the body, he noted bruising around her neck and eyes, as well as a cut on her arm. There was also slight hemorrhaging of the eyes. The combination of these factors could indicate that she was strangled, so the mortician phoned police. As Ethel was taken to the medical examiner's office, investigators processed the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, and family couldn't identify anything that was missing. Sergeant Jim Bell immediately thought of Daniel Troyer and brought him in for questioning. But whatever suspicions he was having, he didn't share them with the media. Whether it was intentional to trick Troyer into thinking he had fooled them and let his guard down, or something even less strategic than that, Sergeant Jim Bell was quoted as saying, quote, "The only similarities are that the victims are elderly women and that they were found dead in their home, period." But that was far from the truth. At Ethel Luckow's scene, another towel with semen was found, which is just really gross and disturbing every time I say it. I really can't even get past saying it without being disturbed, but it's true and it definitely connected the crime scenes. Ethel Luckow's death was ruled a homicide. On August 22nd, 1988, her life was honored by friends and family. In attendance was her dear friend, 72-year-old Lucille Westerman. Lucille had been so upset by Ethel's murder. She went home and was fearful for herself and their friends and family as well. She only lived 3 blocks from Ethel. The following day after the funeral, on August 23rd, 1988, Lucille's sister came over to take her out to lunch. When she arrived, the yard gate was open and her sister's house was unlocked, which was extremely uncharacteristic of her. When she walked into the home, she called her sister's name but got no answer. She walked into Lucille's bedroom and found her propped up in bed, unconscious and bleeding from the mouth. She rushed over and felt for a pulse, and miraculously, she had one. They called 911, thinking she had a stroke. She had been under a great deal of stress from her friend's death. She was admitted to the hospital where she remained in a coma. In Lucille's bedroom, there was a single nylon stocking in the garbage, a pair of scissors on the floor, and a broken palm frond on the floor. All of this was next to her bed. Her large family prayed for her recovery. She was also a devoted member of the LDS Church, worked at the temple, and was a loving grandmother and great-grandmother. But her miracle would not come. Lucille would cling to life for 6 weeks before ultimately passing away. Testing and an autopsy ruled out all causes of death being natural, so her death was ruled suspicious. Lucille lived alone. She loved to garden, and she seldom left her home in her car. She only drove just to go grocery shopping and do her temple work. In the weeks prior, while Lucille Westerman still lay in the hospital unconscious, Bell had two suspects in Ethel Luckow's murder, Troyer and a different daytime burglar. But that other burglar was in prison, so he was scratched off the list. Troyer was technically under custody and supervision of the halfway house, but he had that freedom for the barber school, which was right around the corner from the homes. Witnesses reported seeing Troyer near Luckow's home 2 days before she was suspected to be murdered. Investigators had a pretty good idea based on the autopsy of when that time was. As Bell interviewed Daniel Troyer, he changed his story about where he was on the day they suspected she was murdered several times, at least 4. When called out on these inconsistencies and contradictions, he finally said that he had lied because he had broken the rules of the halfway house by visiting his sister. Sergeant Bell tracked down this sister who said she had not seen her brother in years, but he had called her out of the blue to be his alibi for the day Ethel Luckow was killed. Sergeant Jim Bell felt like he had Troyer in his crosshairs. He had built the case, but you will not believe what comes next. The judge suppressed the interview because Troyer had not been read his Miranda rights. For some reason, Sergeant Jim Bell had thought that it was unnecessary to read them because he was interviewing him at his halfway house. I struggle with this. That's a big messed up from Sergeant Bell. When you have a case this big, you cannot afford not to dot your I's and cross your T's. You have to go by the book and assume nothing. But I have bigger beef with this judge. If you need to throw out the interview with Troyer because of the Miranda rights issue, fine. But he did a sweeping throwout of evidence. He said that not only did they need to throw out the interview, but also the sister's statement, the jailhouse statements from cellmates who said he confessed to murders to them, and also he denied DNA testing of Troyer's hair. So from there, detectives had to wait until DNA advancements allowed for more precise testing and hope that technology would win out. And in the meantime, they had to hope that no other women would fall victim to Daniel Troyer. One thing in their favor happened in the meantime. Troyer had broken the rules of the halfway house by his own admission, and thus he was back to the confines of regular prison, without the freedom and opportunity the halfway house correctional facility had allowed. Also in the meantime, prosecutors appealed the evidence suppression of the judge, but it would take years to go up the court chain. So that next big break would happen in 1996. The judge's decision was brought to the Utah Supreme Court and was overturned. This allowed much of the evidence from Ethel Luckow's case to be used. 2 new detectives dusted off the case files and built a case against Troyer. They painstakingly built it for 2 years. The clock was ticking as his 15-year sentence would be served in September of 2000, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't get out any sooner. At the end of 1998, new DNA testing had come a long way, and detectives decided they wanted to test the yellow towel with semen on it from Ethel Luckow's crime scene. And jackpot. It was revealed that it was almost certainly that of Daniel Troyer. There was only a 1 in 105 billion chance it wasn't. A trial was set forth for Daniel Troyer. He was facing charges in the death of 2 women, Ethel Luckow and Drusilla Ovard. In Drusilla Ovard's case, he faced first-degree felony murder and aggravated burglary, which would make him face up to life in prison. In Ethel Luckow's case, he faced a capital murder charge, which was punishable by execution. Troyer had no way out of it. DNA evidence overwhelmingly proved his guilt alone. Troyer had allegedly told 2 prison inmates that elderly women were, quote, easy prey. He had discussed the yellow towel with them. In 1999, Troyer pled guilty to both murders to avoid the death penalty and was given 2 consecutive life sentences. It gave some measure of answers to the families who were left in the devastating wake. If you think about it, Drusilla Ovard played a crucial role in getting Daniel Troyer caught. She fought back, and the bruising and injuries she sustained gave the lead detective at the time the hunch that they should be looking for a burglar with an injured right hand. Drusilla's granddaughter Kathy described her grandmother as sweet and gentle, who wouldn't hurt a fly. But her fight had broken his right hand. Her granddaughter said, quote, "For her to physically hurt him, she must have been terrified," end quote. Daniel Troyer wasn't done. The same year of his conviction, he confessed to other murders. This was part of an additional plea deal where he could confess to additional deaths with the promise he wouldn't be charged with them. The goal of this was to get answers for other murders. He confessed that he had murdered Thelma Blodgett and Lucille Westerman. And he even had one more, one who police didn't even realize was a homicide. As Daniel Troyer was confessing to crimes, he caught them off guard with one. He confessed to the 1982 murder of a woman named Diesta Easthope. Diesta was 54 years old, and her body was found unresponsive in her home. There was no obvious signs of a homicide, and her death was suspected to be of heart failure, which that was what was put on her death certificate, and she was just buried that way. But her family did feel off about it. She was found nude, and her door was unlocked, two very uncommon things for her. Their nagging feelings even had led them to request that her body be exhumed 5 months after her death, but they were talked out of it. Now they learned she was a victim of Troyer. Interestingly, in a strange twist of fate, Easthope's own son was incarcerated with Troyer for a period of time. Troyer had befriended him, and it would take all of these years to find out that Troyer had murdered his mother. Troyer was said to show no remorse during his confessions. His tone was flat, he was nonchalant, and he struggled to even remember all the details. One investigator with the Salt Lake City District Attorney's Office, a man named Michael George, I think summed up Daniel Troyer's crimes best. He said, quote, "When you think of these women, you think of love and sweetness and everything that was right in the world. The way he met most of them is they were out working in their gardens because they were interested in the beauty of life. Troyer takes what we see as being right in the world, of being able to have our mothers and grandmothers doing what they should enjoy doing. He takes all of that and destroys it by his actions." So let's get back to Bertha Hughes then. Troyer was out of jail and available to commit the murder at the time it happened. But it's interesting that he didn't confess to her crime. On one hand, he had nothing to lose. His plea agreement allowed him to confess to all crimes he committed without the worry of being prosecuted for them in the future. By not confessing to Bertha's murder then, he risked not having immunity to that if it was tied to him at a later date. At the same time, he was spending 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So if he was connected to Bertha's case later, it really didn't change his outcome either. And it's not uncommon for killers to hold back secrets to maintain control in a situation where they have no control. But there are a few things that are different. In all sources I could find on Bertha's case, it sounds like she was the victim of a sexual assault. Troyer did have a sexual element to his crimes, but he was known more for posing his victims and exposing them and then masturbating. It's possible that this changed over time, but Diesta Easthope would have been committed in the same year as Bertha Hughes, and hers was more like the later ones. There is also the forced entry of the kicked-in doors. It is thought that experienced burglar Daniel Troyer would meticulously and carefully break into homes and lie in wait, or attack when the women were least expecting, or coerce his way for them to open the door, and then he would leave it unlocked when he left after staging the crime scene to look like a natural death. Bertha's door was thought to be kicked in as she looked in the peephole, which is a much more aggressive strategy, and then a violent struggle was said to have taken place, and evidence of that struggle was everywhere. One other thing that doesn't quite track is that police did take items from the crime scene, and they are well aware of Daniel Troyer's MO. So you would think that they would have tested any of the crime scene items against Troyer's DNA. I haven't been able to find any articles saying they have done so. I found a 2020 article that stated that the case still puzzles the cold case unit. And so my assumption is that either they could not find anything testable on the items they have from the scene, or they have tested them against Troyer and it isn't him. Also in 2020, current detective Ben Pender did confirm that old evidence was being tested again. He said, quote, "Something that was examined 10 or 15 years ago, we can re-examine that today. Sometimes we can be successful at that. It all depends on the item," end quote. So it is possible that there is evidence still to test again that maybe just was tested years ago without all the advancements we have now, and maybe that would connect Troyer to her crime scene. We don't know. One other thing to note about a possible connection of Troyer to Bertha Hughes, remember that creepy magazine salesman the neighbors reported to police? If you remember, they described him as 30-ish with dark hair and a dark mustache. I'm going to share a photo of Troyer on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod, and boy, are you going to be shocked at what you see. He is a dead ringer for the description. He would have been in his 20s at the time, but his mustache could have made him look a little older. If you're keeping track of the women I've mentioned, you may have noticed that we haven't hit the number I mentioned at the beginning. And that's because in order to tell this story in a way that made sense, I had to tell some of it chronologically up until we got into Daniel Troyer territory. It was important to tie out his story before I muddied it up before going into other ones. But just to help you keep track, at this juncture of the cases I have mentioned, Bertha Hughes is of course still unsolved, as is Wilhelmina or Billy Reed. But her case would get answers many, many, many years later. In 2019, DNA caught up to a former neighbor. Interestingly enough, this man's name is Brian Reed. He was only 17 at the time. It was no relation. Billy Reed's last name is spelled R-E-I-D, and Brian's is R-E-E-D. His stepmother used to have coffee with Billy. He had fled to Nebraska on the day of the crime, and robbery appeared to be a motive. His rapid departure was questioned by police at the time, but suspicion dissipated when they found out that his move was planned and his plane ticket booked a while in advance, so the timing just seemed to be coincidental. Confronted with the damning DNA evidence, Brian Reed admitted to climbing in through her bathroom window, going into her bedroom, and hitting her with a baseball bat multiple times. There are a few more cases I want to touch on. Some are resolved and some not, but I want to look at them and compare them to Bertha's case. The first is the 1985 suspicious death of Mary DeLuca. In August of 1985, 82-year-old Mary was found in her basement, partially clothed next to her washing machine in the town of Midvale, just south of Salt Lake City. She had been dragged a short distance to the final location in the basement, and a plastic bag was stuffed in her mouth. Mary did not live alone. Her husband was upstairs in the bedroom. He had profound health impairments, and he was a patient at a VA hospital, and he was just home on a weekend visit. When he was found upstairs, he was ill and disoriented. He would not have been able to commit the crime, and he was likely just uncared for because his wife was harmed. But I want you to prepare yourself, and I want you to hear what the investigators determined happened. Because the house was locked and there was no sign of forced entry, they ruled out foul play. Instead, they determined that Mary likely had a cardiac event, stumbled, and fell, and while she was on the floor, gasping for air, the plastic bag became lodged in her mouth and cut off her airway. They then think her medically frail husband may have gotten confused and moved her body after death. This was officially what they went with, and her case was closed, and it remains closed to this day. So she's not counted among the deaths. It's insane to me that this theory was agreed upon and went with. It reminds me of the Netflix Unsolved Mystery coverage of Amanda Antoni, which I don't think she died by the weird accident that they reconstructed either, but hers is even more believable than Mary's. Mary's death occurred 7 miles away from Bertha's, and the circumstances are pretty different, so I don't personally believe there's any connections. But I do think Mary DeLuca's death should be re-examined and that it should be seen as a murder. The next is from later in 1985, the murder of Jean Muir. The day after Christmas, Jean Muir was going to do some shopping with her sister. She spoke to her sister on the phone at 12:30 p.m. When her sister arrived at 1 p.m. to pick her up, She found Jean dead on the floor and her car missing. She was stabbed numerous times with scissors. A flower vase was broken in the struggle, and she was stabbed with the broken pieces of that too. Jean's car was found a few days later abandoned behind a business. Jean's case is also being investigated by Detective Ben Pender, just like Bertha Hughes. In this instance, both cases had a struggle, though Bertha was beaten, and then Jean was stabbed. Nothing, particularly something as big as a vehicle, was taken from Bertha's home. It also appears that Jean was not sexually assaulted, and Bertha was. Jean's case remains cold and unsolved. In October of 1989, 71-year-old Flora Rundle was found face down in the bathroom of her home on 3518 South 300th Ave. This is only half a mile and a handful of blocks away from Bertha's home. She had been stabbed to death. She lived in a business district, and her murder occurred on Sunday when most of the businesses were closed. Thus, police had a hard time coming up with witnesses. Like so many other murders, police couldn't determine motive or anyone who would want her dead. In 2014, DNA once again caught up to a perpetrator. A cab driver named Gary Dean Hilfiker was already in prison for the 1992 murder of his girlfriend. Testing in 2014 in Flora's case came back with Hilfiker as a match. Her evidence had been preserved, and they were just overjoyed to get a hit. Hilfiker admitted to giving rides to Flora many times, as this was her primary mode of transportation. He then decided one day he was going to break into her apartment. He stabbed her and took about $200 from her purse. He was given an additional life sentence for her murder. The murder has a lot of proximity to Bertha's, as well as forced entry. In the case of Flora, her door had been pried open. But in the end, it seems like this case was mostly about robbery, though the possible connection to Bertha is worth looking into. Hilfiker's murder of his 1992 girlfriend was gruesome. He stabbed her 11 times and set her house on fire. He claimed he was on a multi-day cocaine and alcohol bender during this time, and he says that he has since become a born-again Christian, and he has been seeking parole for years. But now that he has Flora Rundle's case added in, it's very unlikely that this is going to happen. The last case is from 1991, when 78-year-old Lucille Johnson was bludgeoned to death inside her home at 4284 South Holloway Drive. This is 3.5 miles southeast of Bertha Hughes' home. Her case would sit cold for 23 years until DNA evidence from the crime scene was matched to her killer. Same as Flora's, investigators had retested crime scene items and matched them to already convicted killers. This killer was incarcerated in Arizona, but the testing in this case was going to blow your mind. This isn't like the towels or the broken vase. It was a children's toy. Colorful interlocking Legos found on the floor. Her family said Lucille would never leave her grandchildren's toys out on the floor. She was very pristine and meticulous about how she kept her house. So they were collected as evidence. DNA evidence from underneath the nails of Lucille matched that of a man named John Sansing. The fingerprints on the Legos matched those of his son, who would have been 5 years old at the time. John's son was present at the time of the murder. Police believe he may have used his young son as a way to gain entry into the home. Investigators suspect he gave his son the Legos to play with while he brutally murdered the elderly woman. John Sansing was eventually charged in 1998 for the murder of a church worker. In that case, in February of 1998, he called the Living Springs Church and requested a food box. He gave the church his name and address and waited for the volunteer to show up. He called his wife to say he smoked crack cocaine and was waiting for her to get home to smoke the rest with her. He also said he ordered a food box from the church. When his wife returned home, he let her know he planned to rob the church worker so that they could use the money to buy more drugs. Church worker Trudy Calabrese arrived at 4 p.m. with 2 boxes of food for the family. She was younger than these other victims, just 41 years old, and she was a wife and mother of 2 young children. She felt moved to volunteer for the church and dedicated her life to community service. She chatted up the family, including the young kids who were present, as Sansing signed for the food. As she turned around to leave, Sansing threw her to the ground and tied her up with the help of his wife. Trudy cried out, "Lord, please help me," and pleaded with the children to call police, but the parents told the children to go watch TV in the other room. He hit her over the head with a club hard enough to break it in two. He then dragged her into the bedroom, sexually assaulted her, stabbed her several times, and put a bag over her head and secured the bag with necktie and cords. Before her death, the children later testified they heard her saying, "Lord, I don't want to die, but if this is the way you want me to come home, I am ready." He covered her body with laundry in the bedroom, stole her jewelry, then he left the house and traded the jewelry for more drugs. The church called later that night looking for her, and he lied and made up a fake address and said the food had never come. He then moved her truck and concealed her body in the backyard behind a shed under debris and an old carpet. The plan didn't work. Police found her vehicle, and inside they found the name and correct address on it. They found her body in his backyard. John Sansing was sentenced to capital murder for her death and is currently sitting on death row in Arizona still. His wife avoided the death penalty but was sentenced to 25 years to life for her part in the crime. John lived in Utah at the time of Bertha's murder, but he would have only been 15 years old. Part of what I wonder is where he went to high school, and I just couldn't find that information. Did he attend this school across the street from Bertha? I looked into some yearbook information online and couldn't find that he did go there, but I don't have a tangible yearbook in front of me. So, listeners, if you're out there and you attended Granite High School in the mid-1980s or anywhere in the area at the time, write to me and let me know if John was a classmate of yours. It's possible Bertha was his first homicide and that he noticed her looking out the window. Okay, guys, that was a lot of information and difficult to hear about details, but I wanted to go in depth with these for a few reasons. These women were the matriarchs of our society. They had volunteered in their communities and taught children and had babies and grandbabies and hobbies. They had passions like gardening and cooking and volunteering at their churches, and they were all at a stage in their life where they should have just been able to enjoy these things. In examining the still unsolved case of Bertha Hughes, I think it's important to note that she could have been a victim of any of these violent predators. Or it's possible that there's one more source of evil who preyed on an innocent woman. I want to know what you think. Do you believe Bertha was a victim of Daniel Troyer? Do you think she was a victim of one of the other killers mentioned? Do you feel her case is connected to any of the others? Be sure to tell me by interacting on Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. You can also email me at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com, which is where I like to take case suggestions as well. You can also go to the fan mail part of Buzzsprout and click the text me link. If you have any information on the unsolved murders of Bertha Hughes or Jean Muir, please contact the Unified Police Department Detective Ben Pender at 385-468-9816. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime, a weekly Monday podcast that challenges the illusion of safety in our days of nostalgia. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review, subscribe, and tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening.